So this is one of my favorite talks to give, and I say that for every talk, but this one really is one of my favorite talks to give. And it started out a number of years ago as a presentation called Git Makes Me Angry Inside. So this will start with a bit of a calibration for the audience, just to see sort of why you're here. Who thinks Git is weird and hard? Hands up, please. Great. Who thinks Git is easy? Fewer hands, great. Who thinks only Gits raise their hand when asked? This is the morning test. 1 or 2, excellent, thank you very much. So now that I've completed the audience calibration, the next thing that I need to do is say some invigorating words which will get you enthusiastically either frustrated or excited about this wonderful topic of Git. So we'll start with the good, the bad, and the ugly of what Git means to a lot of people. So we'll start with the good. And I think that Git is particularly good at being a content tracker for text files. It is limited in its goodness to just that much. Content tracker for text files. The next thing that I think that Git is really good at is that it's very fast compared to centralized version control. Now, again, that's a pretty limited statement, so now we get to go into the bad parts of Git. And Git is, unfortunately, not magic. I mean, there's those moments when it takes its head off and it feels a little bit magical, but it's not actually magic. So now let's look at the things that Git is not great at. Git is not really a great dependency manager. For those of you who've worked with submodules, you'll perhaps know what I'm referring to. And we'll talk a little bit about dependency management later on. It's particularly not very good at access control either. And by not very good at, I mean it doesn't actually do access control. And we need to put systems on top of Git in order to make that access control happen. Git stores full file snapshots. It doesn't store the diffs. That is controversial for some. And it becomes slower the larger your repository gets. And when I mean large, I mean really, really large. So how many people in this room work with repositories that have more than 10,000 commits? Yeah, maybe 10%, that's fine. How many people have no idea how many commits are in their repository? Yeah, it's more like it, all right. And so finally, the ugly bits of Git. This next slide, read it all, read it carefully. I know it's early in the morning, but it's not actually your fault that Git is weird and hard. Git is weird and hard because the internals of how the storage mechanisms work are highly opinionated. But the interface, the thing that we actually type our commands into, if you're at the command line or you point and click on, is not highly opinionated. And so this disconnect between their front and back end, shall we say, of Git, makes it really frustrating to use for a lot of different teams. So perhaps, obviously, this presentation is going to contain some opinions. Some of you will agree with many of the opinions. Some of you will disagree with everything I say. I salute you for those points of view, both positive and negative. But the thing that I want you to come away from today's presentation is there are 4 main, let's call them areas or golden rules. It's important to put a fun title on things. And I think that with these 4 points over the years of teaching version control, they are either conflated, they're mixed together, or they're not properly discussed and appreciated within teams. So the first one is the talk to your teammates rule, and it ultimately is the governance rule of Git. Talking about how you're going to have your access controls, talking about how you're going to have permissions within teams, who gets final say on what goes into a repository. Do you have a QA bot? Do you have a QA person? Do you have peer code reviews? Do you have mechanical code reviews? That first part is often not talked about. It's just assumed knowledge or tacit knowledge. The second point is to separate your ideas, and this is branching strategies. So I'll go through a couple of different ones, Git Flow, GitHub Flow, and GitLab Flow, because apparently you need to have the word flow in your branching strategy for it to be an official strategy. The third one is to be consistent. I will try not to rant about rebasing, but this is my little rebasing rant. And then finally, to include only what you need in your repository, and I'll mention things like shallow clones, and I probably say the S word once or twice in there in terms of submodules, and the differences in the style or design of your repositories, whether it be microservices or monolith. So those 4 ideas, if you come away with nothing else from this presentation, it's to have that discussion with your team and be intentional in these 4 areas. So let's take the first rule, or the golden rule first, to talk to your teammates. It's sort of a weird one now that I'm in the position that I am to be saying this is the governance section. But I've found that in my researching for writing the book Git for Teams, this was something that was not really discussed ever as being a governance issue, and more sort of tucked off to the side of being, well, of course, because you're using this particular storage tool in terms of the online systems, whether it be the Bitbuckets, the GitHubs, the GitLabs, the whatever, they all have their preferred way of working. And so it's assumed that if you're in one of those particular tools, you're obviously working in that particular way. And it's not actually that obvious. Now, this has also changed a fair amount with branch locking, and I believe Bitbucket was the first to introduce this concept. Thank you, Subversion, for the idea. And so it has changed a little bit over time, but the basic setup in Git is you still have some kind of centralized repository that you're then doing a clone to, and then making your local commits and pushing it back up again. So the access control part is saying, what do we do as the intermediate step? And all of these slides will be online. I am charmed that you're taking pictures, but I am going to go through them fairly quickly as a warning. So either camera up the whole time or just put it away. So the question becomes, in terms of the governance structure, is do you need that intermediate repository or not? And that intermediate fork on the shared hosting system originally would have been replaced by an email list and patches being sent round. So it's a question of how do you actually pull these things together and allow governance to happen within your teams. Now, I would say that there's a few different models that you can use. Many of you will be in Bitbucket or other lesser systems, but hopefully not. Well, maybe someone's still using Stash, but probably you're in Bitbucket, which is fantastic. And probably you're working in a system which has branch locking involved, and everyone's committing into that centralized repository. However, I have worked with teams, even as recently as a few months or a year ago, who were using the GitHub style of that intermediate repository because it gave them this safe place to upload their branches that were in progress as a private sort of secret place for changes to happen and be stored offsite. So kind of like an offsite backup from their local development environment. And then when they were ready, they would go ahead and make a pull request from their personal copy of the repository into the team's repository. So there's no one single right way of doing it, but it is something that you should discuss with your team. Because if you are a team that likes that intermediate clone or fork on the centralized code hosting system, and someone isn't following that rule and they're just chucking all their messy branches into your main project, you can end up with a pretty frustrating experience between teammates as you work this through. So just decide on what your governance model is going to be. Talk to your teammates. I know it can be difficult sometimes, especially for those of us who work on distributed teams, but sit down and figure out what those rules are going to be. Once you have that access mapped out, it becomes a lot easier to actually map out the commands that you want people to be using, write those cheat sheets, have an onboarding process for new team members to have it be a consistent, and we'll come back to that rule in a little bit, a more consistent experience. And of course, if you want to take advantage of branch locking, it's not something that Git offers natively, but it is something that you can take advantage of if you want a bit more control. So the next idea is to separate your ideas. And this is where we get into the idea of branching strategies. And I would say that there are maybe 3 or 4 different branching strategies out there that are well recognized, they're well documented, and you can use them as a starting place for your particular team. There is no reason to follow any one of these branching strategies exactly. They're just a starting point for you to figure out what's going to work best in your particular instance. So in order of complexity, starting with, I would say, the least complex system, we're going to look at GitLab Flow, which basically says whatever the environment you're on currently, that should be the name of the branch. So if you're on prod, you have prod checked out. If you're on your staging environment, then you have staging checked out. Branch per feature, one of the more common ones, especially around continuous deployment. And then finally, one of the original ones in terms of being explicitly written down for software production, but also one of the most complex ones is the Git flow model. So state branching, actually, how many folks are using each of these? So how many folks are using something like this in terms of a state branching setup where your branch names match the environment? Yeah, so there's a few, there's 2 or 3, and there's nothing wrong with any of these. I use multiple strategies or branching strategies depending on the project. So a couple, again, per environment branch names. The next one, branch per feature, or the GitHub flow model. How many folks use something like this? Much higher, maybe about 30%. I know there's about 20% of you who aren't going to raise your hands. You're not really sure why I'm making you do this. And furthermore, I'm speaking too quickly. And then finally, we've got our scheduled release or our Git flow model. How many folks use something like this? Yeah, so evenly split, I would say, between the scheduled release and the branch per feature branching strategy. And as you can see, this one gets a lot more complicated. And you can build up to those levels of complication. So if you all start originally in the develop branch and basically do branch per feature, so you're working off to the right as you make your individual features or bug fixes or whatever they happen to be, you bring them back down into develop, you get ready for a release. At that point, you add your release branch. You actually, do more testing and make more fixes in there, but no new features are getting in, and then you add in your master branch or your sort of official release, numbered release. Fine, now you've added one more set of branches in there, and then you've got the hot fixes as they need to have point numbers added to that master branch. So you don't start with this complexity, but for someone who's new into your team, to an established team, this is a pretty darn scary place to exist if you've never worked with this particular model before. So do provide that documentation. Do make sure that you're helping people be consistent, and make sure that you limit those commits, or in your ball and chain diagram, to only one idea. Laurie talked a little bit yesterday about doing code reviews or peer reviews. Go back and watch the recording if you haven't seen her talk yet. I think it's a really important thing to remember to put those or to limit those ideas in each of those individual commits, and squish things down, the interactive rebase squash things down before you merge them in, so that when you're actually using some of the more advanced tools, they're not really advanced, they're just not as commonly used, like Git bisect, you're actually landing on whole ideas when you do that binary search back through the history. If you haven't done squashing before, it's super fun. I'm happy to show you how that works after the presentation today if you need a bit of a hand on that one. The other thing to be aware of is if you're working in a pull request model where you have this whole conversation happening in a web UI, make sure you take the time to compress that conversation and give yourself an amazing commit message, which actually includes the rationale for why the changes were introduced. I can read, and everyone can read, the diff file that explains what was changed. But giving yourself the rationale, especially if you're doing fine-tuning work, so you change a number from 300 to 500, why did you change that number? Explain in your commit message, and don't rely entirely on going back into that web UI for the full explanation of what's happening. So I did jump through a number of different models. Many of you were familiar with at least one of those models, which is fantastic. But have that conversation with your team. Explain in diagrams the action of drawing out, of physically drawing those like lines and circles out will help to reinforce which different commands you're going to want to use at each of the stages, and get other people up to speed. And one of the things that I found with Git is that it's that embarrassment of not really knowing what the next command is that I should run, or understanding what mess I've put myself into, and not wanting other people to reveal that sort of lack of excellence. And so the more that you can talk about things, the more you can draw them out, the more you can have your horrible diagrams initially that you refine over time, the more that you will make Git a friendly place to be and make it more consistent for people to use. So in this one, I'm going to say that the consistency is, when I think about this one, although yes, the maintenance strategies, or the branching strategies are something you should follow, specifically what I'm using in this context is the maintenance strategy. And for maintenance strategy, I would say, how do you keep your branches up to date? That's what I'm referring to. Now, the reason why I think this is a really important point, and the reason why this gets its own section, is because there's a lot of different ways to do pretty much exactly the same thing in Git. This is, if you don't know about Tim Toady, there is more than one way to do it. Thanks, Perl, for that one. And Tim Toady basically says, I'm going to update my branch. Which of the following methods do I want to use to bring my branch up to date? And each of those is absolutely correct in some circumstances. In fact, there's so many different ways to be right that I made a flowchart for it. And it turns out, I was talking to someone last week, it turns out that the Git or Rebase flowchart would pass some job interview exam questions. So I'm quite pleased with this one. But you can see that there's no single instance. You know, when people say, oh, you should always rebase, well, that's not necessarily true. So take a look at how your team is bringing those branches up to date, and think about how are you going to use the branch, or how are you going to use the Git history? Because if you're not trying to read those ball and chain diagrams, if you're not using Git bisect on a regular basis, it sort of doesn't matter about rebasing. You can just bring things up to date with merge. It's not going to blow everything up. It'll all be okay. And this is where like a third of the audience just gave me their sour, sour look of, I can't believe you just allowed people to update branches without using Rebase. But if you've got a team who doesn't ever look at history, and you're always moving forward, and you debug things and you troubleshoot things by only looking at this current state of code, you don't go back through history to see at what time something broke, why does your history matter? Why does it matter? So take a look with your team. How are you using the tools? When something goes wrong, how are you troubleshooting things? And then make the decision on how you're going to bring your branches up to date. And for me, a new appreciation for rebasing came in because I didn't particularly care. I looked at the landscape by looking at what is the code like right now, not what was it like 5 commits ago. What is it like right now, and what's broken right now? And that's how I was doing my troubleshooting. Now, one of my coworkers was doing the troubleshooting by trying to figure out at what point in time did this break. So he was using Git bisect, and he was the one that was doing all the credit card processing. I was the lowly front-end developer who was making sure that stuff lined up. And so for him, the troubleshooting process was very, very different. What he needed to be able to do was say, I know we had credit cards coming in 3 days ago, so why are we, I'm exaggerating by a little bit, but it was that action of, I know this used to work, why does it not work today? So the way that he wanted to look through the repository was with that Git bisect, the binary search down to the point where on this commit, something broke. There's something in this diff that is resulting in our code no longer working. As soon as I appreciated that that's how he was doing his debugging, it was no problem for me to be doing rebasing. It was absolutely no problem at all because it meant that Joe got to go home earlier. He didn't have to stay late. I wasn't preventing him from going and spending time with his family by my updating branches through merge. Talk to your team, find out how they work, write down the rules, and I love telling this story about Joe, but our rule was we will follow the documentation, whatever it says. And so we ended up in this kind of passive-aggressive documentation editing, which was great because the documentation was always up to date, but it was depending on who had most recently edited it that we would have one method or the other. And until I had that conversation, all I was frustrated that he kept changing it to be Rebase. Talk to your team, and if you care about your commit history, then definitely teach your team how to use Rebase, teach them that it's not scary, teach them this headless thing is actually not that big of a deal, it'll all be okay, and you get to go home earlier. So be consistent, ultimately, is the end of my little rebasing rant on that one. And finally, my last rule is to include only what you need. Now, these ones are a bit controversial, and I'm hoping that what we can do is just kind of raise hands. You'll have a lunch break a coffee break after this session, and there may be some conversations that can spark out of this one. So when I say outsource your dependency management, and where possible, avoid using something like submodules, but instead use something like Composer if you're in PHP land, and this is where everyone will know what their build management tools of choice are, dependency management tools of choice are. So when I say outsource your dependency management, for how many people is this a highly controversial statement who want to talk about it later? No one. And how many people think this is awesome and they completely want to talk about how to do this later and how to never have to use submodules again? Okay, only Nicola is being honest. And how many people just don't want to have to think about it because it's way too early in the morning? Yes, you are my people. So ultimately, if you aren't wanting to talk about this as a group, think about versioning your build manifest. So that's my kind of key takeaway on this one. If you must include external work in your repository, keep your core clean and track upstream work with named branches. Nest your repositories without tracking by using subtrees, which is essentially a Git clone or a Git repository inside a Git repository. I'm happy to talk more about that from a Drupal perspective. And yeah, again, submodules are hard. I felt really vindicated a couple of years ago at Git Merge when someone on stage who was far more clever in Gitways than me mentioned submodules, and 2/3 of the audience groaned really loudly. And then he kind of told them that they were all Git developers, not just developers, but Git developers, and they should fix it. And 1/3 of the audience groaned even louder. So there be dragons. Finally, on this one, store as much as you need, but not more. So this is the concept of a monolith versus a microservice, and to think about, what do I need for this repository to be complete and whole on its own? Can I subdivide it out into microservices? If yes, how do I manage the relationships between each of those different repositories? This becomes a software architecture question, and again, a discussion for you to have with your team to start thinking about, when does it make sense to pull this stuff out? And in some cases, when does it make more sense to put this stuff back in? So we recently at work moved from, it was something like 30 individual repositories back into a monolith because it was only ever deployed as a whole, and we decided that the cognitive overhead was much easier for the team if it was in a single monolithic repository. Allow your binary files to exist outside of your repository. This now is, I believe, baked in with Bitbucket, that you can track files outside. And use, for very large files. I mean, sort of tiny assets, no problem. I'm talking about video assets. I'm talking about if your designers also track their files in there to pull that stuff out of the repository. Happy to chat a bit more about this later on, but Git LFS, the large file system storage, is the one that you're looking for on this one. When you're actually doing your deployments, go ahead and use shallow clones. You don't need all 10,000 commits, when you actually do a deployment. And also, if there are specific branches that you need, you don't need probably all the branches to be part of your deployment. Finally, as a quick summary, including only what you need, there's links in each of these slide notes. I will upload them, I promise, to give you more information. Outsource your dependency management, though. Leave that stuff to your programming language, not to Git. Break your repository into smaller service repositories when it's time, or combine them if it makes sense. Binary files do grow. Think about outsourcing that to Git LFS. And finally, use shallow clones for faster deployments. So these golden rules: talk to your teammates. This was the governance section of things. Separate your ideas, branching strategies. Be consistent in how you maintain each of those branches, my little rebasing rant and my, my passive-aggressive documentation reference. And finally, include only what you need in the repository. So those 4 rules, I think, are critical to having a happy and healthy Git experience as a team. As I mentioned, there are more resources. There's links after these ones here. Gitforteams.com, you look for the link at the bottom of the home page called Offsite Resources, and that's my mega list of all of the things on the internet that I think are exceptionally well done when it comes to documentation of Git. And then also those diagrams are linked from the home page of Gitforteams.com as well. Thank you very much.